Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are excited to be back on our virtual presentations over what is supposed to be winter anyway, and making it easier for everyone to get here. But also excited that we are celebrating a lovely non-winter winter for the most part this year. So we'll leave it at that. But regardless, we are glad you are here with us with the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and I would like to thank the Ramsey County Library System for co-hosting this with us, as well as the Arts and Cultural Legacy or Cultural Heritage Fund for helping support programs like this for the White Bear area. I'm Sarah Hansen, the Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and in full disclosure, Father John Markoe, who you are going to be hearing about tonight, is a great uncle of mine and one of my heroes, but a very interesting and complex character, which you'll learn quite a bit more about as we go. I did not have the privilege of knowing him. He passed away a little bit before I was born, but I am thankful to Matt Holland, our speaker, and who is able to help bring him to life for me and for many of us, because he led a pretty extraordinary life and impacted many. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to author and historian Matt Holland, who is our guest tonight, who is an expert on such topics. Matt is speaking to us from Omaha, Nebraska. So again, thankful for the wonders of technology that make that possible. He was here in November doing a bit of a circuit, but we love this opportunity. And I know we have folks from all over the country joining in virtually tonight. So Idaho and Florida and some other places. So thank you. Thank you all again for being here. And I will turn it over to you, Matt. Let me know if you have any technical difficulties. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A as we go. So if you have questions, please pop the questions into the Q&A if possible, because we can track them better that way and mark if they've been answered or not. We'll let Matt do the presentation and then do questions at the end. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll start by thanking the White Bear Lake Historical Society and Sarah and the Ramsey County Library for this opportunity. As Sarah said, I was up in St. Paul in November doing some presentations at St. Thomas and a couple of the Catholic parishes, and it was a joy to be in the land of the Markoes, is how my family thought of it growing up. As you can see by the opening slide, my presentation tonight is going to be about the life of Father John Markoe, SJ. The SJ is for Society of Jesus. He was a Jesuit priest for 50 years. And you can see he was born in 1890 and died in 1967. Before we leap into his life, which as Sarah said it's fascinating, I want to give you a little bit of background on who I am and why I'm the one to present on him today. Maybe. Let's try this again. I think my share froze. Hold
on. Technology.
Well,
it's okay.
Sarah can attest this was working.
Exactly.
I am not able to advance my slides.
Is it
You are sharing. I'm going to try a new share. PowerPoint. There we go.
There
okay. We are in.
All right.
All right. So this is some background about me and why I'm here to speak to you tonight about Father John Markoe. I've written 2 books. One recently this summer that's his biography, one that came out in 2014 that was basically about him and a group that he started in Omaha called the Omaha de Porres Club. Those 2 books come from my family connection. And I'll show you this picture right here is, that's my father, Denny Holland. He passed away in 2003. He is actually pictured on the cover of this book right there as a 21-year-old Creighton University student. But the reason I have this picture isn't so much about my dad as much as I loved him. It's about the photograph that's in the background. And as you can see, it's the same photo that's on the cover of the Markoe biography. That photograph, 11 by 17-inch black and white photograph of John Markoe, hung in our house for 40 years. So right next to the crucifix in the front room. So he was part of our family, very much so. And I grew up with him in our family. He was an influence on my parents and on my older brother. So I came into this with a personal connection through my dad, that then as I learned more and more about John Markoe, a friend of mine once said, "That guy's in your head." And I said, well, if you got to have somebody in your head, he's not a bad guy to have in your head. And you'll find out why. He's an amazing character. So I've written a couple books, my family connection, and you're going to see a lot of primary sources that the majority of came from my dad's archive of materials that he kept. And they are currently, with permission from the Markoe family, I donated those to the Creighton University Archives here in Omaha. So I am obligated and quite pleased to be able to say that the archives is letting me to continue using those documents in these presentations. So that's enough about me. My goals tonight, the way I've laid this out, the story of John Prince Markoe, is there's some early parts of his life growing up in St. Paul, a little bit about White Bear Lake, his time at St. Thomas Academy in St. Paul, a middle section of his life that I kind of headed, officer, all-American alcoholic, and you'll get to see how that plays out. And the last part is a black robe. The time in his life where he becomes a Jesuit, and the sections of that are a pledge, traveling, and then a home in Omaha. And we will go ahead and get started on that. These are some pictures of the Markoe homes that John Markoe grew up in. He was born on November 1st, 1890, actually in the house on the left, 815 Ashland Avenue. And then his family later moved to 1937 Selby Avenue, that they grew up in those homes. He and three brothers and two sisters. And his father was a physician, actually was the attending physician at St. Thomas Academy. This is a photograph, 99.9% sure Sarah and I talked, that's White Bear Lake. John Markoe is second from the left with his hands on his hips. I'm pretty sure this is his younger brother, Robert, and this is his older brother, James. Not sure. That might be Brick Hilger over his shoulder. I'm not sure. This is a picture of the Markoe. It says 3 generations of the Markoes. This is his father, James Markoe. John is the top left in this photograph. And then his brothers, Robert, Francis, William, and James, are the 5 that wrap around the back of that photograph. And his 2 sisters, this is a very male-centric photograph. It says the generations of Markoes. Well, there were wonderful women in the family as well, Marie and Margaret, who both became visitation nuns in the Visitation Convent in St. Louis. So they built their home. They had a summer home on White Bear Lake. John recalled that's where he spent his summers, was swimming and spending the summers in White Bear on the lake. He attended St. Thomas Academy, started in 1903. That was the first year St. Thomas Academy began their military program. So it was a boarding school / military academy. And he attended there until 1908. This is a zoomed in photograph, and you can see the circle around John Markoe and the Corps of Cadets in that photograph. One of the stories that I came across, actually was in his diary. He collected demerits. Really, he was very good at collecting demerits in military programs. And one of the mornings, he would take the streetcar from the house on Selby Avenue to St. Thomas, but there were other students who were living in dormitories on campus, and John and a friend of his found a muskrat that came up had along the Mississippi River there. They took the muskrat, took it into one of the dormitories, and let it go in the bed of one of their classmates. So he was, I think Sarah and I talked about it. The word I like to use is rambunctious. He had a lot of energy. He liked to pull pranks on friends, and that continued throughout his life. Because of his experience at St. Thomas Military Academy, he became interested in applying for being admitted to West Point Academy. One of his uncles was Michael Morgan, who was a general during the Civil War on the Union side. It was actually on Ulysses Grant's staff, and he was living in Minneapolis. And I think he had an influence on John. John applied to and was admitted to, given the opportunity to take the entrance exams, I might say, to West Point. And he took the admission exams, was admitted, and started at West Point in 1910. This is an article that came out in a Minnesota newspaper as he approached graduation. Minnesota boys make good showing at West Point. J.P. Markoe, he was a dashing, soon-to-be cavalry officer when he graduated. He was also an All-American football player. He played on the 1913 and 1914 Army teams, started at end, played against Jim Thorpe, played against Notre Dame when Newt Rockne was playing for Notre Dame, excuse me. And he was a very well-respected member at West Point. He did have one problem that popped up that almost derailed him as he started drinking during his first year at West Point. And he faced either court-martial or resignation, but the commandant of the Corps decided, based on the information he received from other officers, that he was going to give John a second chance. He had the entire Corps promise to keep an eye on Markoe, and if he ever started drinking again, to let him know. And with that assistance, John made it through his 4 years at West Point. This is a picture of the 1913 Army team. And I've zoomed in, and you can see at the bottom, Dwight Eisenhower, in a book by his grandson, David Eisenhower, said that John Markoe was, and the quote is, "the best potential officer I've ever seen," is what Dwight Eisenhower said about John Markoe. This is John Markoe standing in the middle of that, and off to the right there, kind of slumping in the sweater, that's Dwight Eisenhower. He was a halfback on that team. So Eisenhower saying that Markoe's the best potential officer he'd ever seen. He added to that statement, except for the fact that he could not control himself when he was drinking. John graduated from West Point in 1914, went to the Mexican border, the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa, the revolution was going on. He was stationed along the border in Texas, and without the Corps of West Point keeping tabs on him, it was just a matter of months before he had multiple infractions involving alcohol and was court-martialed and dismissed from the military for, again, he actually pulled a weapon and discharged a weapon at one of his troopers. So he was out of the military and returned to St. Paul. And I'm going to back up that statement, stigma and odium, that is from a letter that his father, James Markoe, wrote to the War Department pleading that there should be some way that it was too harsh that he had been dismissed, and was there any way that the family could get rid of the stigma and odium that was attached to Markoe's disgrace? Not only was it in St. Paul that he was facing this disgrace, but I found well over a dozen articles in newspapers from here in Omaha to Honolulu to Provo, Utah, that had front page articles like this one. And I would liken it today to like a crawl on CNN. It was this was a big deal. Sentence of Lieutenant J.P. Markoe was confirmed. President Wilson has confirmed the sentence of dismissal. Got violently drunk, soldier now dismissed. John Markoe was found guilty of having become violently drunk. Dismissed officer. He's dismissed. He comes back to St. Paul. He's trying to figure out what he's going to do. And his family and he are trying to get him back into the military. So he joins the Minnesota National Guard as a private, is given a commission to captain by the governor, and ends up going back down to the Mexican border again and serves for about a year. He during that time, he was thinking about maybe going to Minnesota and playing football. He played on some all-star teams against some semi-pro teams in St. Paul and Minneapolis. But the whole time he's doing that, he and his family are trying to get him back into the military. The Markoe family was fairly prominent. A bill was put on the floor of the House of Representatives by a Minnesota member of Congress, and a bill was put forth on the Senate floor by a Minnesota senator with the intent of getting John Markoe readmitted into the U.S. Army, unsuccessfully. He ended up going to work for a short time for Minneapolis, that should say steel and machinery. The picture of him is circled there. He's looking pretty dapper in his Homburg hat and a starched shirt and tie. He was an assistant to the president of the company, M.E. Mallon, who was a family friend of the Markoes. But all that time, he was trying to deal with that shame and disgrace. His younger brother, William, who's in the photograph circled on the right, had joined the Jesuits and was at a seminary in St. Louis, and he was praying for John to open his mind to becoming a Jesuit, taking a vocation as a Jesuit priest. William is a character that another book needs to be written on. In the 1913 St. Louis University yearbook, underneath his photograph, next comes our invincible hero, King William, hails from the wilds of Minnesota, holds his title from his equal alertness in metaphysics and extemporary speaking, and is a sunbeam in this benighted region. He continually in letters pulled at John and asking him, had he thought about taking a vocation as a priest? John did think about it, had thought about it, felt he wasn't able to because of his past, and William convinced him. William said, I've talked to my superiors. It's only convicted criminals that can't join the Jesuits. So he said, John, you're okay. So John Markoe did join the Jesuits. That's a picture of him on the left. William to his left on our right at St. Stanislaus Seminary in Florissant outside of St. Louis, Missouri. One of the interesting things I found, and William and John were aware of it, is that St. Stanislaus was built by slaves that were brought by the Jesuits from Maryland, and many of the slaves after emancipation remained close to the seminary. And this is a photograph of one of those slaves who would not have been alive when John and William were there, but his descendants would have been. And so William had started working in the communities that surrounded the seminary that were comprised of the descendants of the Jesuit enslaved people. And then while they were just after John arrived in Florissant, the East St. Louis massacre, as it is known, took place just 15 miles from St. Stanislaus. 100 estimated 100 Black St. Louisans were killed, and the combination of working with the descendants of the slaves and the St. Louis massacre led them to, along with two other Jesuits, sign a pledge in August of 1917 to dedicate their lives to, as they put it, the salvation of the Negroes in the United States, and that they would repeat that pledge daily, which John and William did for the next 50 years as Jesuits. They were Jesuit priests first, but their second vocation was working with converting, and then later realizing that it wasn't just converting, but also working to improve the lives of the African Americans in the United States. That created some tensions because that was not the mission of the Jesuits. John was moved around a lot. Everywhere he landed, he did something. And in hindsight, they see, looking back now, you think, well, they weren't big things, but at the time he was doing them, they were very controversial. This is a picture of him on his ordination in 1928. And John was, as you can see on the title, the heading there, he taught at University of Detroit, he taught at Creighton in Omaha, he taught at Marquette in Milwaukee, he taught at Regis College in Denver, he taught at St. Louis University. Everywhere he went, he would do something that would, in some small way, break a barrier about race in the university system of the Jesuits. And while he was at Creighton in 1930-31, I believe, were the the school year he was here, he started a group for the handful of Black students at Creighton. It was the 4C Club, Creighton Cooperative Colored Catholics, I think, and its purpose was mainly to find a place for the Black students to find a place to live off campus, because they had difficulty finding a place to live off campus. And this was in the Creighton student newspaper. It talked about that the club that John Markoe had started was nationally known and was one of the few university clubs like this in the United States. He was moved from Creighton. He went to Marquette. This is a photograph of him walking into the Jesuit church that's on the campus at Marquette. He was the director of the Sodality. And Sodalities, I found when I came across that word, I'd never seen it before. It was a cross between a religious group and a fraternity. They were a big thing in the early and middle part of the century at Catholic universities and high schools. And John was in charge of the one at Marquette. You can see in this photograph, students are going into Jesuit for the one of the events related to the Sodality. All those students in that photograph, you can tell, are white. While John was at Marquette, he admitted the first Black member to the Sodality. It happened to be a guy named Ralph Metcalf, who some people who are Olympic or track aficionados will recognize him. He ran with Jesse Owens. He won a silver and a bronze in the 1932 Olympics. He wanted to become a Catholic. John Markoe tutored him and then admitted him to the Sodality at Marquette, again, as the first Black student in the Sodality at Marquette. John Markoe was moved from Marquette shortly after that. He also, along with his advocacy for Blacks in the U.S., he was a gifted draftsman. That was one of the things he became really good at when he was at West Point, and he created a number of charts and publications that were published. This one, I was told by a Jesuit here at Creighton that this was published, I believe, in early 1920s. It was still being used in theology classes in training Jesuits well into the 50s and 60s. It became known as the famous Markoe chart. it depicts the purpose is to show that the Catholic Church was the one true church, and he starts a timeline, and the Catholic Church is at the top on the left, and then all the other denominations that have come along over time are shown with the smaller timelines. And it was used to show to converts that the Catholic Church was the one true church that all denominations derived their beginnings from. So he was doing that at the same time. He did not have any incidents involving alcohol for many years as a Jesuit in his training. And he kept busy. He did things like this. I don't know if it was willpower, prayer, a combination of the two. Until about 1936, he was moved by the Jesuits. He wrote a friend that said as John put it, he barely, very nearly wrecked the intersection of Grand and Olive in St. Louis. He was outside of a bar, belligerently harassing people and had to be restrained by police. The Jesuits sent him to St. Joseph's Hill Infirmary about 30 miles outside of St. Louis in the foothills of the Ozarks. That was run by Franciscan monks. And John was there. For those of you that are sports fans, he was a player coach. He was the chaplain as well as a patient for about the next 7 years. This is what now remains of St. Joseph's Hill Infirmary. It was very remote. It was hard to get there. Train was the one way you could get there in the 30s. This is a brochure about St. Thomas Infirmary. This is the cover of that brochure. It shows John Markoe, who's the chaplain, visiting with the brother superior of the Franciscans who managed and maintained the infirmary. In 1943, John was moved back to St. Louis, and he wrote one of his brothers. He said, I made some resolutions, and he came back and was assigned to a Black Catholic church, St. Malachi's, and he was approached by a parishioner, a woman whose daughter wanted to go to St. Louis University, but St. Louis University did not admit Black students. And John began a campaign, and the whole time was doing that, he was also trying to manage his alcoholism. In this letter he wrote to Brick Hilger, one of his childhood friends, in May of 1944, he wrote that he has been sitting on top of the flagpole for over 10 months now, and he doesn't know what to think of it. At times I get so damn desperate that I feel like heading for the Rockies, locating a cave filled with bears, and moving in with them with a 1,000-gallon drum of hard liquor as the only piece of furniture. So he continued to struggle with alcoholism, but while he was having those struggles, as he wrote in his letter, he made some resolutions, and those resolutions were to begin to act more emphatically on his pledge of 1917. And he made some very the moves he made reflected what he had learned at West Point. There were some flanking moves. There were at the end, when he wrote it up after St. Louis University was defeated, from his point of view, he used military terms, a flanking move, and those type of things to describe his efforts. But he began to pressure St. Louis University that's where he was trained to be a Jesuit. He pressured St. Louis University to admit Black students. And by April of 1944, St. Louis University had admitted for the first time African-American students to attend university there. He was moved. 2 years later, John was moved. But before he moved, one of the newspapers wrote that he was a leader in the fight to admit Negro students to St. Louis University, and he is now a member of the faculty at Creighton in Omaha, Nebraska. I think perhaps the Jesuits moved him there thinking, what can he do in what can he do in Omaha? What kind of trouble could a guy get in Omaha? John found a way to get into trouble fairly quickly. So in 1946, the Jesuits moved him to teach math at Creighton University in Omaha. And he spent the rest of his life he died in 1967. The rest of his career was spent in Omaha. And in those 21 years, he found a home, he found a purpose, and he found a way to put that pledge to use in ways that he had not been able to do so before. And part of that was the group that's pictured in this photograph was a large part of his success, and what sense of redemption he did find was because of this group. It was known as the Omaha Divorce Club. He founded it, and it was named after a mixed race saint in the Catholic Church who was a patron saint of racial justice, St. Martin de Porres. He had been John Markoe, who's here in his full cassock. This is on the steps of the administration building in Creighton in 1948. He was approached by this young man here who was my late father, Denny Holland, who wanted to talk about racial matters. And John Markoe said, why don't you get some people together and I'll get some people together. John Markoe loved to spend his time in the Black community. That was when he had free time. He was walking in Omaha. Creighton University bordered what was known as the near north side, which was Omaha's ghetto, Omaha's Black community. And John would spend all of his time walking the neighborhood, visiting. Many of the establishments were bars. He would visit the bars, but John Markoe went and gathered members from St. Benedict the Mooric Black Catholic Church, as well as some other community members. My dad went and got some white Creighton students and some other young people, and they started the Omaha Divorce Club in the fall of 1947. John Markoe wrote this credo and pledge for the Divorce Club. It was printed on little pocket-sized, back-to-back pocket-sized paper for the Divorce Club members to carry, as much for their edification and understanding as if they needed to give one to a member of the public. But you can see he talks about inalienable human rights, compulsory segregation, discrimination against individuals because of color only. And I'll tell you, my dad said he thought he was joining a prayer group, that they were going to talk about racism and maybe read some books. And John Markoe had different ideas, and my dad said he found out pretty quickly that Markoe had no intention of it being a prayer group. And they became a pioneering, cutting edge, out beyond what was happening at the time. It's the late 40s, early 50s in Omaha, Nebraska. They were doing stuff that wouldn't happen in other parts of the country, including the American South, for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in some cases a decade. They were doing activities. They were asked to leave the Creighton campus. They had met on the Creighton campus for about a year. They were asked to leave the Creighton campus because of the controversy they were creating. They rented a storefront on North 24th Street, which was and still is the main thoroughfare through Omaha's Black community. John Markoe told them, the members, I found this place we can rent. You can see on the window, it was Maria's Espanol Tamales and Chili Shop. They repainted it. It was the Omaha Divorce Center for about 2 years. These are photographs of Divorce Club meetings inside of the Divorce Center, taken by my father. And you can see John Markoe's looking very comfortable, and the mix of students was very controversial. You had young Black men with young white women and vice versa. It created, just that by itself was enough to create a good bit of controversy. This is a photograph. My dad is leading a meeting. He was the president of the Divorce Club. Father Markoe is sitting up front. And above and behind John Markoe is a photograph of a painting of St. Martin de Porres. As my dad remembered, John Markoe spent a lot of time helping people like my dad understand racism and its ramifications. And for about a year and a half, they did a lot of the sweet, gentle things, my dad called it. And then Markoe said, we need to start doing some stuff. And I don't think anybody quite understood what he was talking about, but they started doing some things that Markoe had written down. This was a chart that he had just, I can see this coming out of his head in about 10 minutes. Once they opened the DePorres Center, he sat down, and this is about a 20 by 20 piece of paper. And he just started writing everything that he had learned from William, everything he had experienced, everything he knew that they needed to do on this piece of paper. This is what the inside of his brain looked like. Everything is just on this piece of paper. And this is an excerpt, how I describe it in the book, about I said, John sat down and drew up a detailed organizational chart, and it had 10 headings: supply, publicity, program and entertainment, emergency, intelligence, medical, legal, political, civil, educational, liaison. But it wasn't, and then underneath some of those, there's 30 listings of, under publicity, it's newspapers, radio, flyers, but it wasn't just a list, it was his battle plan. He was putting together, these were the supplies we needed, these were the fronts we needed to attack on. He created this list, and then he used that as a blueprint for the DePorres Club to do what they were going to do. This is a picture of Markoe and DePorres Club members in front of the Omaha Star, which was and still is Omaha's leading Black newspaper on North 24th Street. The interesting thing about this photograph is on the far left, again, is my dad, who was the president of the DePorres Club. This is a DePorres Club member named Max Brownell. This is Mildred Brown, who was the publisher and owner of the Omaha Star. John Markoe. This was a woman named Jean Waite, who was the DePorres Club secretary, who, as it turned out, married this guy over here, Denny Holland. And so my parents met in the Omaha DePorres Club. So when I do presentations, I'll say, I am here because of the Omaha DePorres Club. And I mean, I'm here because of the Omaha DePorres Club. That's where my parents met. And then this is a woman named Eve Hanna, who was an older member of the Omaha DePorres Club. They ended up, the DePorres Club closed their center, and John Markoe and Mildred Brown worked out a deal where the DePorres Club could use the Omaha Star offices to hold their meetings. And they did from 1950 to 1954. And she let them use the offices for free to hold their meetings. And she got a lot of really good newspaper coverage out of that. You'll see in just a minute. This is a photograph I found fascinating. This is the Omaha branch of the NAACP about 1952. And as it is, and it should be, the NAACP was made up, predominantly of African Americans. But you can see in the back row, about in the middle, John Markoe is standing there, and off to his left, the right of the photograph, are Jean Holland and Denny Holland, who, as I said, the impact that he had on them and therefore my family is hard to exaggerate. One of the first things the DePorres Club got involved in was a house that was purchased by a gentleman named Woodrow Morgan, who was a Tuskegee airman who had been shot down in Europe, was a prisoner of war held by the Germans in Italy. And he came back to Omaha after World War II, went to work for the Union Pacific Railroad, saved his money, bought a house for his wife and him and his 3 kids. But the house was 1 block outside of what was considered the bounds of the Black community. And when the neighbors found out who had bought the house, they threw rocks, they broke windows, they threw paint, they threatened, if the Morgans were to move in. The Morgans went to Whitney Young, who was the head of the Omaha Urban League at the time. And Whitney Young then went to the DePorres Club and asked for their help. And this is a letter that was written by Lester Granger, who at the time was the executive director of the National Urban League, describing what Whitney Young had told him. And Whitney Young said he called Creighton University and explained the situation to Father John Markoe. The neighborhood in question was a strongly Catholic area. On the morning when the moving van was expected, Father Markoe and one of his white students was on the porch of the new untenanted home. Neighbors came asked if he was looking for the former residents, and Markoe said, "No, we're here to help the new owners moved in." And because of his presence, the family was able to move in. Did not experience any problems, but my dad did remember that Woodrow Morgan did have a shotgun leaning against the corner of the porch as they were moving the boxes in, just in case. And there's a picture of Woodrow Morgan, and that is the picture of the house in North Omaha that they moved into. And my dad said he remembers sitting there with Markoe, just scared to death, and John kept saying, "It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine." They then started going after businesses. John convinced the members that the way to improve the lives of the people living in Omaha's Black community was through employment. So they started approaching businesses that would not hire Blacks and asking them to hire Blacks. And then they did something that was unheard of. They started threatening boycotts. And the first one was as you can see, in 1950. By February of 1951, the company, the At Home Sherman Laundry dry cleaners, had hired to work in the office and drive vans. But what I love is that one of the businesses that was started in reaction to that was a laundry that staffed completely with African Americans, including the manager and the assistant manager. And when I just know that when I talk about the Omaha Divorce Club, I'm talking about John Markoe. He was in full control and in completely guiding every move that was made. Basically, he told my dad what to do, and my dad did it. It's kind of how it worked out. Omaha Coca-Cola Bottling Company was another business they boycotted. This is one of the flyers that they used. John Markoe and my dad went up and down North 24th Street collecting signatures on a petition for companies to say they would not restock Coke until Coke opens employment at all levels to Negroes. It might have taken them a while to collect these signatures. A lot of these are barred. So I'm thinking, just to be neighborly, John might have stopped and had a drink in most of these places. But they got these signatures. They got these signatures. I believe there are 43 businesses that said they would they would cease carrying Coke until Coke changed their hiring policies. The president of Creighton University, Carl Reinert, reached out to John and said he had heard a rumor that Coke had hired a couple of Black employees. And John said, well, in this letter that he wrote to Father Reinert, he says in the middle paragraph, perhaps it might be wise to hold off on a letter of congratulations. And in the meantime, maybe send a letter asking if should be something that Creighton should be thinking about, whether they should continue to sell Coke at Creighton. So Father Reinert wrote this letter to the plant manager and, asked questions about, is it, if you're not hiring people because of the color of their skin, that doesn't jive with what we talk about and profess and act on at Creighton. Can you help me understand? And then I love this, the next to last paragraph. I certainly do not want this to seem like a threat. Rather, I'm seeking for advice and guidance. So at John Markoe's guidance, the president of Creighton University writes this letter and then basically, drops the bomb on Coke saying, we aren't going to carry Coke if you don't help me understand what's going on. So Mac Gothard, who was the plant manager, he didn't, this is Omaha, Nebraska in 1951. This is not something that you were watching on the news. When this was happening, Matt Gothard called them, both what Markoe was doing and what the Divorce Club was doing, a series of impulsive, threatening, and peculiar actions. And 15 years later in an interview, he was asked about it, and he said, if confronted by such a group today, my hair would not bristle upon my back as it did 15 years ago. So the Poorest Club was out of bounds as far as what was accepted. And again, all of it was because of John Markoe. Coca-Cola said they hired these two employees. They took these photographs. The Poorest Club didn't trust him. The Poorest Club had asked in their boycott for a change in the policy of their employment. Coca-Cola finally gave in, and the Poorest Club declared that the boycott was over at Coca-Cola. And again, I told you, Mildred Brown, who was the publisher of the Omaha Star, she got a lot of good front page stories off of letting the Poorest Club use her offices. Reed's Ice Cream was another company they went after. Again, Reed's Ice Cream in the Black community didn't hire any African Americans to work there. This is one of the flyers they used. This is a photograph taken outside of Reed's Ice Cream in the summer of 1953. The gentleman in the straw hat was a Poorest Club member named George Barton. He had a twin brother named Sam Barton. They were very good friends of John Markoe. When George Barton was arrested for picketing one in front of the Reed's Ice Cream, he was put in a cell and not allowed a call. So he took a match, lit it, blew it out, wrote John Markoe's phone number on the inside of the matchbook and gave it to one of the guys who was getting out. And John Markoe came down and got George Barton out of jail. Finally, after a year of, as it says, a year of heavy loss in business, Reed's Ice Cream put a Negro sales lady to work at their main station and continued after that to hire African-American employees. But this is my favorite. This was in the Poorest Club meeting minutes, and this would have been John Markoe's Christian charity forgiveness being modeled at its best. After the boycott was over, in the meeting minutes after that, it says, after the meeting, many members went to Reed's Ice Cream and enjoyed some ice cream. Markoe, it was not personal. It was about convincing people to do the right thing. Markoe and the Poorest Club garnered the attention of the FBI also. This is a letter that was in the FBI file. It's been redacted in places from September of 1953 regarding the Omaha Poorest Club and Father John Markoe. There's several letters throughout the years that the Poorest Club was in existence. The final boycott they did was with the bus company, the Omaha Constable Street Railway Company, for their refusal to hire black drivers. One of the things they came up with, and this was a boycott that took place years, almost a decade before the Montgomery boycott, bus boycott that we tend to think of as the beginning of the civil rights movement. They said the fare was 18 cents, protest by using 18 pennies with the intent that it would slow things down. Eventually, the company gave in and hired 4 black drivers. And about the time this was in 1954, about that time the Poorest Club kind of came to, and for all intents and purposes came to an end, because many of the members had gotten married and were starting families. And so the Poorest Club kind of went silent, and John Markoe moved on to some other activities. As my dad said, John Markoe would do business with the devil himself in order to eliminate the evil of racism. So without the Poorest Club, he moved to some other activities. One was he wrote a pamphlet laying out that racism, discrimination based on race, was a moral matter, which was not an accepted stand in any of the Christian faiths, especially in the Catholic Church. That was not stated by the Catholic bishops until 1958. And this was a pamphlet he put together and was printed and given imprimatur, the final permission in 1951, and it lays out an example of racial discrimination where a white business owner refuses to serve a black customer, and John, using his moral theology training and his training in math and logic, lays out this argument, coming to the end saying that yes, it is obvious that racism is immoral. He had these printed, and then he and William came up with the brilliant idea to send them to every Catholic priest and superior in the United States. I believe that was at the time about 15,000. And this is a column from America magazine, the Jesuit magazine in 1952, describing how a leaflet written by John Markoe is being distributed by Emmett J. Colligan. And if anybody recognizes Colligan, like, hey, Colligan man, the Colligan Water Company, he was a childhood friend of John Markoe's, and he was also a millionaire, and he helped John distribute copies of that pamphlet to every Catholic priest in the United States. This is a letter that Emmett Colligan wrote to a bishop in Minnesota, talking about how one of the priests had written it saying that the pamphlet was not correct and that they should check with a theologian. And then John wrote Emmett. This is a letter he wrote to Emmett so gird your loins, as they were getting ready to send the leaflet out. So gird your loins for an interesting venture on behalf of the cause of Christ, with Christ squarely back of us. Be sure to have your knightly uniform and especially your sword ready for any emergency. I'll only have my fists to rely upon, plus the support of my rector, the provincial, and God himself. We will enjoy the backfire together, but never retreat an inch. Those were sent out, and in some cases, as in the case of the priest in Minnesota, they took issue with it. Other people asked for more copies to use, and I believe they ended up sending out close to 50,000 additional copies. John Markoe then, without the DePorce Club, started targeting some other, by himself, working against some racist situations in Omaha. One was the racially segregated Black Catholic Church in Omaha, St. Benedict the Moor. He wrote this anonymous column on the cover of the Omaha Star, challenging St. Benedict's for being a mission church that therefore Black Catholics could not attend any other parish in the city of Omaha. And months after that letter, that status changed. He then, as he got older, he started working with a group called the 4CL, which was a predominantly African-American group led by three members, Black Catholic clergy in Omaha. And he was, you can see in this photograph, in September 1963, he's at the front with those three pastors. He wrote some columns in the Omaha Star, and again, didn't quibble or pull any punches. He called the situation in Omaha a damnable, unwritten, illegal, immoral, rotten, but officially enforced by cowardly and sneaky means policy of enforced segregation. Late in his life, one writer described it, the irony flowed like wine. He began to be honored as a hero, as a pioneer, as a great man. And his response always was, I don't know what the big deal is. I'm just doing what Christ commanded us to do 2,000 years ago. Love your neighbor as yourself. But he began to get honors, testimonial dinners. It's a picture of William on the left, John on the right, and John Howard Griffin, who wrote the book Black Like Me. He and John Markoe became good friends late in John Markoe's life. And in March of '66, the surviving Markoes, Robert had died about a decade earlier. They met in St. Louis for a final family reunion. And then in July of 1967, John Markoe died, heart-related conditions. He had had a series of heart attacks. And my dad, when he cleaned out his room, found this card. Markoe had written down this quote from a book on the life of St. Robert Bellarmine. It is easy enough to throw oneself into work and not impossible to throw oneself into prayer, but to throw the prayer into the work with vigor and persistence is an adjustment that calls for the rarest kind of courage, which I believe the fact that he wrote that and kept it in his room on his desk, that was what he was aspiring to do. And some people would say that someone described him as a walking sermon. And as I read that card, I thought, well, I've found the title to a book, and his biography is called The Rarest Kind of Courage. After his death, the Father General of the Jesuits held John Markoe up as an example to the Jesuits in the United States on how they could work to improve the racial situation in the United States. A house was founded in Omaha by Jesuits from Creighton. It was named the Markoe House. It was in the North Omaha in the Black community to work within the community, continue the work that John Markoe had started. A building at Creighton University was dedicated to him in 1982. Some scholarships at Marquette University were dedicated in his name. There continue to be scholarships at Creighton University in his name. There's a leadership program in his name at Creighton University. This is from the Creighton University website, emphasizing his legacy of anti-racism. And with that, I will wrap up and again acknowledge the Creighton Archives generously granting me the ability to continue to use these documents. And I will thank you for the opportunity to speak about the guy in my head, Father John Markoe.
Thank you, Matt. I've heard this story, and obviously you and I have had many conversations over the last few years about Father John, but I learned something new every time, and that's just sort of the nature of research and history in general. But I think that Father John was so multifaceted and so complex that it's hard to lay him out there and just sort of get the sense. And so thank you for trying to do that in a very quick way. I know it doesn't seem all that quick, but it is for something this big. So you and I have talked a lot, but I'd like you to comment on and you have a little bit, but Creighton, as you indicated, Creighton was not in favor of his activities, and none of the cities or the universities or really the Catholic Church were particularly in favor of his activities, or at least the more aggressive ones in social justice. And obviously that script has flipped a bit these days, and even a bit before he passed. But what are you seeing today? I know with the contribution to the archives and with some of the talks that you've done around Omaha and at Creighton and that sort of thing, there's been a lot of attention brought to this. And I just would like to have you comment for a moment on sort of the viewpoint today.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've told people that I remember hearing my dad say that he was told by John Markoe, this would have been in the early 60s probably, whatever you do, Denny, because my dad was his closest to family and would have been his executor. He said, whatever you do, don't leave my things with a university, knowing that they would have been, the term I use, they were radioactive. They would have been put someplace where nobody could ever see them. And so I held him my dad passed away. I had the opportunity to be the caretaker. And it just kept coming back to Creighton needed to be the place. Creighton needed to be the place. Well, then things happened like the Georgetown and the sale of enslaved people by the Jesuits to help build Georgetown. And then that St. Louis University so then it became, when you said the script had been flipped, suddenly, and rather than try to hide those things, it was almost a race to see who could be the most transparent. And I'd say that in a most positive way. But because of that, Creighton became more and more apparently apparent to me that they were indeed the right place. And they have the archives are if you go online to the collection, they're beginning to share things digitally. They're transcribing the letters. I'm going to be doing a presentation in April it's that they are sharing his story. They've always shared his story, but the only little,
Yeah.
a very clean version. They're sharing the entire story now, and I think that's a very good thing, and it brings a lot of uncomfortable things to bear and to the surface, which that's all John Markoe did his entire life was carry. One of the DePorres Club members said when they were afraid to do an action, Bob Markoe would say, "Well, is it wrong? Then go tell them." Like it was that
That
he
cut and
didn't
dry,
quibble.
yeah.
He didn't quibble, and it was that courage to be able to speak about, act on, acknowledge. And he also did it. And one thing I have to point out, and I don't know if this is true with all Markoes, but he had the most wicked sense of humor. That description of, he could have written, I am struggling with staying sober. No, he wrote, I want to go to the Rocky Mountains, find a cave full of bears, move in with the 1,000-gallon drum. It's like, oh, and just that dark, biting humor. I think that also helped him get through. But yeah, it is becoming more and more so. He's becoming more and more acknowledged as someone who was an unheralded pioneer, and he had been not shunned, but held into the background for so long, and people are realizing that what he was doing, he didn't form any national organizations. He didn't, create, hold conferences. He just did what he needed to do where he was, which I think is a pretty good example.
Yeah. And I think, I would like to add a couple of just quick comments there that, number one, I laugh when we do these presentations or when, you and I have done a little bit, and I know you've done a lot on your own, with the book and the DePorres Club and sharing the history. Father John, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it happens. But my sense of him, and we've talked about this a bit, but my sense of him is that, this isn't what he was looking for as far as accolades or whatever. I think he would love that, if this inspires someone to go out and do something and take action.
Exactly.
And, so I just want to make sure that he certainly wasn't one out there looking for the spotlight, unless it would help his cause. I mean, it wasn't about him. It wasn't about his ego, from what I can take from all of it. And I love that part. He walked the walk.
And he led from behind. He stayed in the background. He wasn't looking for accolades, as you pointed out. And the number of things I found in my research, I got to where it's like, ooh, I can smell. He did, and
he's directing this.
You'd start ferreting out. Sure enough, he was the guy who had moved this thing, who had told this guy to. But you had to really, really look hard to find that he was the guy who had started the whole process. So he wasn't doing it because he wanted anything out of it other than to help. And one of the people that knew him well said he hated racism, but he loved racists. And that's in our current moment, in any moment, but especially in this, that's not a bad model. How can you balance that tension? He was able to do it, and at the same time he was pushing to change things, he was also loving people for who they were and hoping that he could, in his sense, and William was the one who said a lot, save their soul for the sin that they were committing. Mm-hmm. By getting them to see that what they're doing was wrong. Yeah.
Well, and I want to just comment on, we've had a number of folks who have said, thank you for the presentation and thank you for sharing the story, and which is always wonderful to hear. But the other piece that I do want to share too is that again, we've talked about this a bit offline over the years, but I think part of their John fully acknowledged, and William too, but John fully acknowledged that he was a sinner as well. He was flawed in many ways with the alcoholism, with lots of things, and needed redemption. And I think that that helped him carry that message forward. But I also think that personally, I just want to share that they had an understanding of racism in a number of ways, including the fact, as a well-to-do family, their ancestry held slaves. They were a family. We are a family who owned slaves, and so I just want to acknowledge that piece of it as well. And I think for John and for William and several others in the family, but John and William in particular, there was a piece of that motivation and reparation or work that could be done as well as they went forward in their efforts. And it fascinates me how, I mean, John touched many, many things, everything from, again, Dwight Eisenhower and, the football team and all over the place. He's just really an interesting person, regardless of, frankly, the social justice stuff, but that's a huge layer of who he was, but so many elements of it. And I think, thank you for putting the book together. And obviously I'm biased. It's a story that I've always been intrigued by, and to have it compiled and well-researched and done. I'm going to give you a chance to do a quick plug for the book if you would like. Where can people get it the easiest way, or what would you prefer if people are interested?
Amazon is
Either book.
Yeah, they're both available on Amazon. Just
Okay.
Google Matt Holland author and they'll pop up in there. But I'll just quickly say thank you for adding those pieces of his deep understanding of how broken and flawed and undeserving of anything he was, but also that understanding of their family history and what that represented. So, people have said to me, asked me, what was his motivation? What, and it's like, well, it was this, and it was this, and it was this, and it was this. And really, it's a sense of a way for him to redeem himself. There was a lot going on, but going back and acknowledging that their family was, benefited from the work of enslaved people and was definitely part of it. And that's deeply included in the book, and trying to fit everything in here, I sometimes miss that. So thank you for adding that.
Absolutely. It's definitely a piece of the story. And yet it's again, a very complex story. and multifaceted, much like John. So, all right. Well, we don't have any questions, and you and I could talk all night, but we won't subject everyone else to that. But we do have, like I say, a number of folks who have said thank you and appreciate it and had no idea that the story was out there. And I love envisioning John as a young boy or young man at the lake, doing all the things that many of us do in White Bear Lake, skating and swimming and boating and fishing and whatever, because he was absolutely that guy too.
Yeah.
And then as well as, being the religious man he was and so many other things. So I love how it ties this all back to, it's definitely an Omaha story, but he put his mark all over the place as he went. So
yeah, and the Markoe family was the faith, the deep faith of the Markoe family was it forged his early life, and was everything that he became was based on the beliefs and everything that the Markoe family believed in. So,
and that wicked sense of humor. There is someone asking a question about, just a little bit about the writing process itself and the research and how long did it take to put the book together, and all of those sort of logistical fun pieces, if you can speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's someone who's a writer asking that question. Because it's like, it took, the first book came out in 2014. I started researching that in the early 2000s. So that was close to 10 to 12 years. I was working full time, writing before I went to work in the morning, and was unable to find a publisher, self-published that. But as I came to completion of that first book, I sent it off to my oldest son, who's a brilliant, brutal, honest person, and he was always my first reader, and he sent it back and he said, "This is great, but I forgot, was I reading a book about the Divorce Club or a book about John Markoe?" Because John Markoe got into that book and just took it over. I mean, it became 2/3 his life. And I was like, oh, yeah, it is. You can't tell the story of the Divorce Club. It's like we talked about before the presentation. They're one and the same. So I went back into that book with a machete and just cut out piles and piles and piles. And there's 2 little chapters about him specifically, and then the rest of the book. But so that book came out in 2014. But as I was finishing that, I had this pile of stuff on the floor that I thought, oh, okay, that's another book. And so 10 years later, basically 9 years later, this book his biography came out, because I then began doing all, traveled to St. Louis, looking into archives and trying to find every little piece I could, lots and lots of interviews. So both of them took about close to 10 years of research, and then trying to find a publisher, and in both cases not being successful with the publisher, then doing the process of independently publishing it. So a good 10 years on either end but enjoying every moment of it. In fact, getting to the point probably where and totally in my wife's estimation was like, you need to stop at some point. But I was always like, there's got to be, there's one more anecdote, there's one more story, there's one more thing you could find. So, but yeah, they were a joy to write. But I've had many people say, I want to write a book, and I always say, find something that will get you out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning to work on, because otherwise you're not going to finish it. It has to be something that just drives you, and his life and the story of the Divorce Club did that.
Yeah, it's easy to see that, and your passion shows. Final question. Someone is asking, Deb is asking, if you have any future books planned. What you working on? Not at the moment.
Not at this. I have some ideas, but I'm just enjoying telling the story of John Markoe. I really am. That was my goal in both of these books, was to get the story out there so people would know them, and that's happening. And as far as I'm concerned, I've completed that. But there are some other stories, some of them that I came across during this research, where other characters, other side stories that could be developed. But right now, I just don't. That's not a focus. Yeah.
I understand. I understand. You need to recover from this one still, so that makes sense.
Continue to enjoy it is what I'm doing. I really am just like, I don't want to do the writing part right now. I'm enjoying the telling part, and it's a lot of
fun. Have you? I know I said final question, and this truly is the final question because we need to respect everybody's time. But have you ever thought about turning it into a screenplay or a film? Has there been any conversation in that regard?
I have been told by a number of people over the last 20 years that this needs to be a movie. This needs to be a movie. This needs to be. And I think that'd be wonderful. I have no idea how that happens. I don't have any idea what that would, but especially if you look at some of the pictures of John Markoe, it's like, that guy is a movie star that needs a movie made about him. I mean, he has that press. So I would think that at some point, somebody is going to see that this would be a story that would fit, whether it's a documentary or but I don't know. But I have multiple people have said they see this as a movie that should be a movie, and I think, well, good. I probably won't be involved.
Well, you rest and recover from the writing and research process and all of that, and let's chat someday. There is the other piece, movie, whether movie or not, or play or whatever. Minnesota has a wonderful history theater, literally the history theater in downtown St. Paul, that does original things like that. Could always be an entertaining process, but we'll talk. We have way too many ideas and not enough time and energy in the day. So, we'll see what happens.
Okay. And thank you again. And thank you for everybody that was here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.